This week's Parsha starts with a simple basket, and it tells, or actually Moses, instructs the people and tells them, when you come to the land and you settle in it, then take a basket and put your first fruits inside and present it to the priest. And as I began to think about that, I thought, wow, this is a really poignant moment. First of all, Moshe will never get to the land. So he's issuing a command for people who have the opportunity to settle and fulfill his dream, a dream that he cannot fulfill. And he's giving these people who are in the wilderness hope, an image, an ideal, and an aspiration. But when I began to think about it more, I realized, wow, this is such a human image, right? An image of offering our gifts. And then I began to think, well, what is my offering? I'm a rabbi, and I've been studying this book since I was 5 years old. I didn't start rabbinical school at 5, but I went to a modern Orthodox yeshiva called Yeshiva of Flatbush. And I'm also a mother, and I read lots of children's books to my kids when they were growing up. So this represents my gift or my offering of mother love. And finally, I love novels, and I love stories. So that's the through line here, stories, books, text, language. I once had a really interesting Freudian slip. Instead of saying, what street do you live on, I asked someone what page they lived on. It was a little embarrassing. So this farmer, I don't know, microphones are a little intimidating. Here we go, okay. He's standing there with his basket, and it's not exactly, it's not just a rite of first fruits. He's instructed to make a speech, right? To tell the priest his story. So it's not only fruit that he's offering a story. And this is how it goes. And it might be familiar to you, even if you don't know this Parsha. My father was a wandering Aramean, he's instructed to say. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. Arami oved avi vayared Mitzrayma vayagar sham b'mtei ma'at vayihi sham lagoy gadol atzum v'rav. Does this sound familiar to anybody? From Passover Seder. We read this passage at the Seder, and I'll talk about why in a moment. But it continues. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to Adonai, the God of our ancestors, and Adonai heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. And Adonai freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us to this place and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So this farmer is instructed to tell a story in the first person. This happened to me. And in the first person plural. This happened to us, right? This is a we story. This is our story. Now what's interesting, and I think one of the prime reasons this is integrated into the Passover story, is that when we hear the story, we learn of the story in Exodus, it's all told by an omniscient narrator. and this happened to them, and this happened to them, and then God did this, and Moshe did this. But here it becomes the farmer's story. And every generation, even if it didn't happen to him, and the truth is, even if the people who heard this mitzvah in the straits of Moab, before they get to the land of Israel, even if they heard it, it didn't even happen to them. Even if they're the ones that recite it, because they didn't come out of Egypt, their parents did, right? That whole generation died out. So when they say, and we were in Egypt and we cried out, that's an inherited story. That's to be an internalized story for every generation. I was in Egypt, I was in the land of constriction, and now I'm in the land of flow. It's a story of belonging, of internalized collective purpose, meaning the historical becomes personal. Right? And I think that's so different than American society. Right? It's all about the individual. It's all about me, what happens to me, what did happen to me. I go to therapy to talk about what did happen to me. But do I talk about, right, the collective narrative? Do I see myself as part of a larger people, a history? And I think there's something about that that's profoundly healing, right? To not just see yourself as an atomized individual, but understand yourself as part of something bigger, this grand enterprise that started in ancient times. So it turns out there's a whole order of the Mishnah about just this moment. The Mishnah was a 2nd century piece of literature, which is kind of a legal piece of literature, but not exactly. But there are all kinds of instructions in it, but it's not till later on in Jewish history that specific laws are decided. But there's one Mishnah about this moment that is really interesting. It says, Barishonah, in the beginning, Kol shemi yodea lekrot koreh. Every single farmer or every single person who brings first fruits and knows how to read, they should read this recitation. V'kol mi she'eino yodea lekrot, and everyone who doesn't know how to read it. So here I am, a farmer with my first fruits, and I don't know how to recite this. What do? Makrinoto. You read it for him. But then the Mishnah does a really interesting thing. They say, Nimna'u me lehavi. If this law prevents someone from getting up, right? Because if I have to go up there and I don't know this recitation and someone has to do it for me, then everyone knows I don't know how to do this. That's so embarrassing. So what do they say? At a certain point in time, every single person had someone to recite it for them, and then they just followed it. They just repeated after them. So they wouldn't be embarrassed. You wouldn't know who knew the recitation and who wouldn't know the recitation. I think that's such a beautiful thing. I mean, there's so much like performance sort of pressure in our society and so much sort of anxiety about competing and, striving for excellence. Could you imagine if we made the world a little safer so that when we got up to do something, we wouldn't be embarrassed if we didn't know exactly how to do it? The rabbis were thinking about that, right? They were thinking about what would enable us to fulfill this mitzvah of offering our first fruits. What would enable anybody to offer your gifts without shame, without insecurity, right? Can you imagine that kind of collective sort of effort to support one another instead of compete? Wow, that'd be a whole different world. I want to give you one more image about this amazing moment. So the rabbis say that all the inhabitants of the entire land of Israel would assemble in the city of Jerusalem, and they would spend the night in the open street. Maybe they set up tents, I don't know, it doesn't say here. But then it says, and they would spend the night in the open street, and they would not enter any of the houses. So they would leave the inhabitants of Jerusalem who lived near the temple where they were making a pilgrimage to offer their first fruits. They would leave them alone. They would sleep on the streets. But then, early in the morning, the officer would say, and I imagine this is a kind of camp director, "Let us arise, wake up, and go to Zion, into the house of the Lord our God." Wake up, we're going, this is exciting. It's a huge march from all corners of the country. And then they just heard, it's time. Get your fruits, your first fruits, your baskets, and let's go. So this kind of injunction from this kind of camp director, or maybe an early rabbi, makes me think of Rosh Hashanah in 2 weeks. That time where we stand collectively before God, recalling a historical moment, right? It's collectively in terms of like this time, but also, generations before us and generations to come. And we go and we tell God our collective story, our personal story. We say, this is what my life is about, and here's what's in the way. And we pray that God sort of shepherds us on this journey. And we are able to walk away complete and whole without all these barriers to offering our fruits.